My parents had my adjustable medical bed removed while I was in rehabilitation, insisting a regular mattress was sufficient for my recovery from spinal surgery. "You're not in a hospital anymore," my father declared. "Time to sleep like a normal person." I calmly replied, "I understand." What they didn't know was that lying flat could compress my healing vertebrae, and sleeping in the wrong position could cause permanent paralysis. The morning I came home from my 3-week rehabilitation stay, I should have known something was wrong. The house felt different, quieter. My mother's smile was too bright, too rehearsed, like she'd been practicing it in the mirror for days while planning whatever surprise awaited me. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she chirped, practically bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. "We have such a wonderful surprise for you. We've been working so hard while you were away." I wheeled myself through the front door, still getting used to the temporary wheelchair that would be my companion for the next 6 months. The spinal fusion surgery had been successful, according to Dr. Martinez, but the recovery was going to be brutal. 12 weeks of careful positioning, another 12 of gradual mobility, and absolutely no pressure on the healing L4, L5 vertebrae that had been crushed when the construction crane collapsed on me 3 months ago. A surprise? I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach like a stone dropping into still water. Dad appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel with the kind of satisfaction that comes from completing a major home improvement project. His chest was puffed out with pride, and he had that look in his eyes that said he'd solved a problem everyone else was too stupid to see. "We've been busy while you were away," he announced. "Really cleaned things up around here. Made some practical improvements that'll benefit everyone." I navigated the wheelchair down the hallway toward my bedroom, the one I'd been sleeping in since moving back in with my parents after the accident. The construction company's workers' compensation was covering my medical expenses, but living alone in my third-floor apartment had become impossible. At 32, I found myself dependent on my parents in ways I hadn't been since childhood, and every day reminded me how much I missed my independence. The door to my room was closed, which was unusual. I reached for the handle, and that's when I noticed the silence. The constant low hum of the hospital bed's motor was gone. The subtle electronic beeping of the positioning controls was absent. My stomach clenched with sudden dread. I opened the door, and my worst fears were confirmed. My hospital bed was gone. In its place sat a standard queen mattress on a basic box spring frame, the kind of bed you'd find in a college dorm room or a budget hotel. The kind of bed that couldn't adjust, couldn't elevate, couldn't position my spine in the precise alignment that kept the surgical hardware from shifting and the healing bone from compressing. The mattress looked impossibly flat, impossibly wrong, like a cruel joke someone had played while I was away. "Surprise?" Mom announced from behind me, her voice filled with the same enthusiasm she used when I was 8 and she'd redecorated my room without asking. "We got rid of that awful hospital contraption and bought you a real bed. A normal bed that looks like it belongs in a home, not a medical facility." I stared at the mattress, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. The hospital bed wasn't just furniture. It was medical equipment. Essential medical equipment that Dr. Martinez had specifically prescribed for my recovery. Just as critical to my healing as the titanium rods and screws holding my spine together. Without it, those metal rods would bear weight they weren't designed to handle. Without it, the bone grafts could shift. Without it, I could wake up paralyzed from the waist down. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the panic building in my chest like floodwater rising behind a dam. "We returned it to the medical supply company this morning," Dad said proudly, his chest swelling even further. "Save you $500 a month in rental fees. That's $6,000 over the next year. Money you can put towards something actually useful instead of wasting it on hospital theater." "You returned it." The words came out flat, emotionless, while my mind raced through the implications. "You're not in a hospital anymore," he continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he used when he thought he was being particularly wise and practical. "Time to sleep like a normal person. Bedrooms are for sleeping, not playing pretend patient with expensive medical gadgets." I turned my wheelchair to face them, studying their expressions. My mother was beaming like she'd just revealed a surprise birthday party. My father stood with his arms crossed, clearly expecting gratitude for his practical thinking and fiscal responsibility. Neither of them showed any awareness that they might have made a catastrophic mistake. I need that bed, I said carefully, keeping my voice level and reasonable. It's not optional. It's not a luxury. It's part of my medical treatment prescribed by my surgeon. Mom waved a hand dismissively, the gesture so casual it might have been brushing away a fly. Oh honey, you've been sleeping fine at the rehabilitation center for 3 weeks. This is much more comfortable. Real memory foam and everything. We spent extra to get you the good kind. The rehabilitation center had adjustable beds too, I pointed out, fighting to keep the frustration out of my voice. All the beds there were hospital beds, that's why I was sleeping fine. You're being dramatic, Dad interrupted, his tone sharpening with irritation. I slept on regular mattresses my whole life, and my back is fine. Your grandfather worked construction for 40 years and never needed special equipment to sleep. I took a slow, careful breath, feeling the familiar ache where the surgical incisions were still healing. Dad, I had spinal fusion surgery. My back was broken in 3 places. I have titanium rods and screws holding my vertebrae together. The hardware in my back requires specific positioning to heal properly. Hardware, he scoffed, shaking his head like I'd just claimed to be part robot. Listen to yourself. You sound like you're a machine instead of a person. People healed from injuries for thousands of years before they invented all these fancy medical gadgets. That's when I realized they didn't understand. They couldn't understand. To them, my surgery was something that had happened, past tense, a problem that had been fixed by skilled doctors with modern technology. They saw me sitting upright in a wheelchair, speaking coherently, and assumed I was basically fine now, just milking the situation for attention and expensive equipment. The idea that my recovery required ongoing, precise medical care didn't fit their narrative of how healing worked. I'll call the medical supply company, I said, reaching for my phone. Get it back today. No, you won't, Dad said firmly, his voice carrying the authority he used when I was a teenager trying to negotiate curfew. We already told them we didn't need it anymore. They picked it up yesterday morning and were grateful to get it back. Apparently, there's a waiting list for that equipment. You can't make medical decisions for me, I said, my voice getting harder despite my efforts to stay calm. I'm 32 years old. I'm a competent adult. You're 32 years old and living in our house rent-free, he shot back, his face flushing red with anger. You don't get to fill our home with hospital equipment and expect us to work around your medical theater. This isn't a rehabilitation center, it's a family home. Medical theater, that's what he called it, as if the titanium rods in my spine were props in some elaborate performance I was putting on for attention. This isn't a choice, I said, my voice dropping to the tone I used in serious business meetings. If I sleep flat on that mattress, the weight distribution could compress the healing vertebrae. The bone grafts could shift out of position. I could lose mobility permanently. I could wake up paralyzed. Mom stepped forward, her voice taking on that patronizing sweetness she used when she thought I was overreacting to a minor inconvenience. Sweetheart, you're catastrophizing again. You've always been prone to worst-case thinking. People sleep on regular beds all the time without any problems. You'll be fine. People with intact spines sleep on regular beds, I corrected, my patience finally starting to fray. People who haven't had their vertebrae fused together with metal hardware. People whose bones aren't held together with screws and rods. You're being overdramatic, Dad said, waving his hand dismissively. If it was really that serious, that dangerous, the doctor would have made you stay in the hospital for months. They wouldn't have sent you home at all. I stared at him, feeling something fundamental shift inside me, something cold and calculating taking the place of familial affection. They weren't going to listen to medical facts. They weren't going to acknowledge the reality of my condition. They had made up their minds based on nothing more than their own assumptions and prejudices, and my actual health was secondary to their comfort and convenience. I understand, I said finally, the words carrying more weight than they knew. That seemed to surprise them. They'd clearly been prepared for more argument, more pleading, maybe even tears. Good, Dad said, his shoulders relaxing as he mistook my calm for capitulation. You'll see. A good night's sleep on a real bed will do you wonders. Sometimes the best medicine is just getting back to normal. I wheeled myself closer to the new mattress, running my hand along the edge. Standard height, maybe 8 inches off the ground. No adjustability whatsoever. No way to elevate my legs or modify the angle of my torso. No way to maintain the precise spinal alignment Dr. Martinez had drilled into me during every single appointment. Sleeping on this for even one night could undo 3 months of surgical healing and condemn me to a wheelchair for life. You know what? I said, turning back to them with what I hoped looked like a grateful smile. You're absolutely right. I have been overthinking this whole situation. Mom clapped her hands together, her face lighting up with vindicated joy. I knew you'd come around once you really thought about it, and look how much more space you have now. The room looks so much bigger and more normal without that mechanical monstrosity taking up half the floor. Much bigger, I agreed, my voice warm and appreciative. Mind if I make a few phone calls? I want to thank Dr. Martinez for all his help during the recovery process. Of course, honey, Mom said, already turning toward the door. Take all the time you need to settle in and get comfortable. We'll start dinner in a little while. They left me alone in the room, and I sat there for a long moment, staring at the bed that could cripple me permanently. Then I pulled out my phone and started making calls. The first call was to Dr. Martinez's office. I'd been working with him for months, and his staff knew my voice. This is David Chin, I said when his nurse Patricia answered. I need to speak with Dr. Martinez immediately. It's urgent regarding my recovery situation. Is this a medical emergency, Mr. Chen? Should I call an ambulance? It's about to become one if I don't get some guidance, I said grimly. Dr. Martinez called me back within 10 minutes. When I explained the situation, the silence on his end stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. They did what? He finally said, his voice tight with disbelief. Returned the hospital bed. Said bedrooms are for sleeping, not medical equipment. David, listen to me very carefully, he said, his tone taking on the gravity reserved for life-threatening situations. You cannot sleep on a standard mattress, not for at least 8 more weeks, possibly longer. The positioning is absolutely critical for proper fusion. If the hardware shifts even slightly, I could lose mobility permanently, I finished. I know, I tried to explain that to them. Where are you going to sleep tonight? Please tell me you have a plan. I looked around the room, my mind already working through possibilities. I'll figure something out, but Dr. Martinez, I need you to do me a favor. Anything. What do you need? I need documentation. Detailed, comprehensive documentation of what happens if I don't have proper sleeping support during recovery. Medical records, expert opinions, prognosis reports. Everything. There was another pause, and I could hear him thinking. Are you planning legal action against your parents? I'm planning to protect myself by any means necessary, I said. And I want everything in writing, signed, and officially documented. The second call was to my lawyer, Janet Reeves. I've been working with her on the workers' compensation case since the accident, and she'd proven herself to be sharp, thorough, and willing to fight for her clients. Over the months, she'd become something of a personal advocate during the worst period of my life. They did what? She said, her voice rising with incredulous anger that mirrored Dr. Martinez's reaction. I explained the situation again, and I could hear her typing notes rapidly as I spoke. David, this is potentially criminal negligence, she said when I finished. If they're making medical decisions for an adult child without legal authority, and those decisions could cause serious bodily harm or permanent disability. What are my options legally? Well, first we need to get you proper sleeping arrangements for tonight, she said practically. Then we document everything thoroughly, every conversation, every decision, every consequence. And then, she paused and I could hear papers rustling. Then we make sure this never happens again, and we explore whether charges need to be filed. The third call was to my cousin Jake, who worked as a paramedic for the county emergency services. I'd always been close with Jake growing up, but since the accident he'd been checking on me regularly, bringing me books and keeping me company during the worst days. He understood medical reality in a way my parents clearly didn't, and he'd seen firsthand what happened when people ignored medical protocols. They returned your hospital bed? His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Are they actively trying to paralyze you? Do they have any idea what spinal fusion recovery involves? I don't think they understand the risk, I said, though part of me wondered if they simply didn't care as long as their house looked normal. Then let me come over there and explain it to them in terms they'll understand, he said, and I could hear him grabbing his keys. No, I said quickly. Let me handle this my own way. I have a plan. Jake was quiet for a moment, recognizing the tone in my voice. "What do you need from me? Can I borrow your truck tonight? I need to go shopping for some equipment." That evening, I told my parents I was going out to pick up some groceries and personal items, and thanked them again for upgrading my sleeping situation. They were settled in the living room watching their evening shows, my mother knitting and my father half asleep in his recliner with a beer balanced on his stomach. "Don't be out too late," Mom called as I transferred from the wheelchair to Jake's truck with practiced efficiency. "You need a good night's rest in your new bed. The first night's always the most important for getting used to new sleeping arrangements." "I'm really looking forward to it," I said truthfully, though not for the reasons she imagined. I drove to a 24-hour medical supply store across town, one that catered to urgent needs and emergency situations. With my prescription from Dr. Martinez, who had faxed over the necessary paperwork within an hour of our call, and a credit card that could handle the expense, I rented another hospital bed for immediate delivery the next morning. Then I stopped at a hotel that advertised accessible rooms and medical accommodations. I spent that night in a properly adjustable hotel bed, my spine positioned exactly as prescribed by Dr. Martinez. But I didn't sleep much. I was too busy researching, planning, and preparing for what was coming next. My parents thought they understood my medical situation, but they had no idea what I actually did for a living before the accident. They knew I worked in computers and made good money, but they'd never bothered to ask for details. If they had, they might have learned that I was a senior medical systems analyst for the state's largest hospital network, specializing in patient safety protocols, medical liability assessment, and healthcare compliance regulations. I knew exactly what constituted medical negligence under state law. I knew exactly how to document it properly. I knew exactly what the legal consequences could be. And I knew exactly how to protect myself from well-meaning family members who thought they knew better than medical professionals. The next morning, I came home to find my parents in the kitchen, making breakfast and chatting about their plans for the day. They looked relaxed, satisfied, like people who'd solved a problem and were enjoying the afterglow of their good deed. "How did you sleep, sweetheart?" Mom asked brightly, not looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "I told you that mattress would be more comfortable than that awful hospital contraption." "Wonderfully," I said, maneuvering my wheelchair to the kitchen table. "You were absolutely right about regular beds being more comfortable for actual sleeping." Dad nodded approvingly from behind his newspaper. "See, sometimes you just need to trust your old man's experience. I've been sleeping on regular mattresses for 60 years. I know what works." "Actually, I was hoping to discuss the bed situation with both of you this morning," I said, my voice casual and conversational, "just to make sure we're all on the same page about the reasoning behind the change." "Of course," Mom said, setting down her coffee cup and giving me her full attention. "What's on your mind, honey?" I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, making sure it was visible on the table. "I want to make sure I understand your reasoning for returning the hospital bed, for my own peace of mind and medical records." "Well," Dad began, setting aside his newspaper and settling into his chair with the air of a man about to deliver wisdom. "It's really quite simple when you think about it logically. You're home now, recovering in a family environment. You don't need hospital equipment in a regular bedroom. It was taking up unnecessary space, costing ridiculous amounts of money, and making you overly dependent on medical gadgets instead of healing naturally like people have done for centuries. And you believe a regular mattress is sufficient for my spinal recovery needs?" "Absolutely," he said with complete confidence. "People have been sleeping on mattresses for thousands of years without any problems. Your grandmother broke her back in a farming accident in 1967 and slept on a regular bed just fine. She lived to be 93. My grandmother broke her back. Well, she hurt it badly," Mom clarified quickly. "Fell off a tractor or something. The point is, she didn't need fancy equipment or special accommodations. She just toughed it out and healed naturally." "I see," I said, still recording. "And when Dr. Martinez prescribed the hospital bed specifically for my spinal fusion recovery, you felt his medical judgment was incorrect." "Doctors prescribe a lot of unnecessary things these days," Dad said dismissively. "They're just covering their liability, protecting themselves from lawsuits. But common sense tells you that if millions of people sleep on regular beds without problems, you can too. Medical equipment is a crutch that prevents real healing. Even with titanium rods and screws holding my spine together." Especially with titanium rods and screws, he said, warming to his theme. That metal hardware is holding everything together now. You're probably stronger than you were before the accident. The human body is designed to heal itself if you don't interfere with the process. I nodded thoughtfully, making sure to capture every word. That's a very interesting perspective. And you made this decision to return the medical equipment without consulting me or my medical team. We're your parents, Mom said, her voice taking on that tone of maternal authority. We've been making decisions in your best interest for 32 years. We know what's good for you better than anyone else. Even medical decisions that could affect my long-term mobility and health. Especially medical decisions, Dad added firmly. We know you better than any doctor who's only seen you a few times. We've watched you grow up, seen how you handle adversity. You don't need to be babied with expensive medical toys. I stopped the recording and saved the file with a timestamp and date. Thank you both for clarifying your position so thoroughly. An hour later, the delivery truck arrived with my new hospital bed, along with 2 technicians to set it up properly. I watched from the window as they unloaded the equipment, and I could see my parents' faces change from confusion to anger to something approaching panic. My parents were decidedly not pleased with this development. What the hell is that doing here? Dad demanded as the delivery men wheeled the bed components toward the house, his face flushing red with rage. I rented another hospital bed, I said calmly, wheeling myself onto the front porch to supervise the delivery. The hell you did, he snapped, stepping in front of the delivery crew. We returned that equipment for good reasons. You can't just override our decision. And I reacquired it for medical reasons that supersede your household preferences. I replied evenly. Not in my house, he said, crossing his arms and blocking the doorway like a bouncer at a nightclub. You live under my roof, you follow my rules about what comes into my home. I looked at him steadily, feeling that cold calculation settle over me like armor. Dad, this is medical equipment prescribed by my doctor for my recovery from spinal fusion surgery. I'm not asking for permission to have it. You're living under my roof, he said, his voice rising to the volume he used when he wanted to intimidate people into submission. You follow my rules, my decisions, my authority. If I say no medical equipment, then there's no medical equipment. Actually, I said, pulling out a folder of papers that Janet had helped me prepare the night before, let's talk about the legal implications of that position. I handed him the top document, watching his expression change as he tried to process the official letterhead and legal language. What's this supposed to be? He asked, squinting at the text like it was written in a foreign language. It's a legal notification that I'm formally documenting medical interference, I said in the same tone I use for business presentations. Your decision to remove prescribed medical equipment against my will and without medical consultation constitutes potential criminal negligence under state healthcare laws. Mom stepped forward, looking confused and slightly frightened. Sweetheart, we were just trying to help you get better. We thought we were doing the right thing. I know you believe that, I said, my voice gentle but firm. But the result is that you've created a situation where my medical recovery is compromised and my long-term health is at risk. You're being completely ridiculous, Dad said, but his voice had lost some of its bluster and certainty. This is just family business. You can't bring lawyers into family matters. Am I being ridiculous? I pulled out the next document, this one bearing Dr. Martinez's official clinic letterhead. This is a detailed medical assessment from my surgeon explaining exactly what happens if I sleep without proper spinal positioning during the critical recovery period. I begin reading in a clear, professional voice. Patient requires maintained spinal alignment during sleep to prevent hardware displacement, bone graft migration, and potential permanent neurological damage, including complete paralysis of the lower extremities. The color drained from my mother's face as the words sank in. It also states that any interference with prescribed medical equipment by non-medical personnel could be considered gross medical negligence under state law, punishable by both criminal charges and civil liability. You're threatening your own parents? Dad asked, but his bluster was deflating like a punctured balloon. I'm protecting myself from well-meaning interference that could leave me permanently disabled, I corrected. Because if I become paralyzed due to improper sleeping position caused by the removal of prescribed medical equipment, someone will be held legally responsible for that outcome. I handed him the third document, watching his face pale as he recognized the official seal. This is documentation of our recorded conversation this morning, where you both explicitly stated that you believe your judgment supersedes medical expertise and that you intentionally removed prescribed medical equipment despite being informed of the potential consequences. We were just, Mom started, her voice breaking slightly. Trying to help, I finished. I understand that completely. But help that causes harm isn't help, it's negligence. And negligence that causes permanent disability carries serious legal consequences. The delivery technicians had finished setting up the bed and were waiting patiently for my signature on their paperwork. I signed the delivery confirmation and handed them a generous tip for their discretion and professionalism. The bed stays, I said to my parents as the truck pulled away, leaving us standing in a suddenly quiet front yard. And if it's removed again for any reason, I'll immediately file formal charges for medical interference and endangerment. You'd really do that? Mom asked, tears forming in her eyes as the reality of the situation hit her. You would really call the police on your own parents? Send us to jail? I looked at her, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment, the accident that had changed my life forever, the surgery that had saved my mobility, the long, painful recovery process that was still ongoing. And now the realization that the people who claimed to love me most were willing to risk my health and future for their own comfort and convenience. Mom, I said gently, my voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. If I wake up paralyzed tomorrow because I slept on the wrong mattress tonight, will you love me enough to change my diapers for the rest of my life? She didn't answer, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. Will you feed me by hand when I can't hold a spoon? Will you bathe me when I can't shower myself? Will you give up your retirement, your freedom, your golden years to become my full-time caregiver for the next 40 years? That won't happen, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. It could, I said flatly. According to my doctor, it absolutely could happen if I don't follow proper recovery protocols. And if it does, it won't be because of the construction accident. It'll be because you decided you knew better than the medical professionals who spent decades learning how to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. Dad was reading through the legal documents again, his expression growing more troubled and pale with each page. The technical language and official seals were finally driving home the reality that this wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. How much legal trouble could we actually be in? He asked quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier authority and bluster. If I'm permanently injured due to your interference with prescribed medical treatment, I let the question hang in the air for a moment. Criminal charges for medical negligence and endangerment, civil liability for damages that could include lifetime care costs, lost income, pain, and suffering. And since I'm a medical systems analyst who specializes in patient safety and healthcare liability, I know exactly how to document and pursue both types of legal action. You work in medical systems? Mom asked, surprise cutting through her fear. You analyze medical cases for a living. For the past 8 years, I confirmed. I analyze cases exactly like this one every day. Situations where family members override medical decisions and cause preventable harm to patients. I write the reports that determine liability and recommend legal action. You never told us that, she said, as if this somehow changed the fundamental facts of the situation. You never asked what I did for a living beyond something with computers, I pointed out. You just knew I made good money and could help with family expenses. But you made medical decisions affecting my health anyway, based on what? Common sense. Your grandmother's farming accident from 50 years ago. Dad sat down heavily on the porch steps, the legal documents scattered around him like evidence at a crime scene. We didn't know you understood all this legal stuff. We thought. You thought I was just a patient who would passively accept whatever decisions you made. I finished. But I'm not just a patient. I'm a medical professional who understands exactly what you've done and what the consequences could be. I pulled out my phone and showed them a photograph I'd taken the day after my surgery. It was an X-ray of my spine, stark and clinical in black and white. See these metal rods? I said, pointing to the titanium hardware visible in the image. They're holding my L4 and L5 vertebrae in precise alignment while new bone grows around them. If they shift even 2 millimeters, they could sever my spinal cord completely. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. See these screws? They're anchored in healthy bone above and below the fusion site. If improper pressure is applied during sleep, they could pull loose and cause the entire construct to collapse. We had no idea it was so complicated, she whispered, staring at the X-ray image. But you made the decision to remove my medical equipment anyway, I said. You decided that your comfort and convenience were more important than my medical needs, without bothering to understand what those needs actually were. That's not what we meant to do, Dad protested weakly. But that's exactly what you did, I replied. Intent doesn't matter when the result is potential permanent disability. I sat there in my wheelchair, looking at my parents as they processed the reality of what they'd almost caused. They weren't evil people. They weren't trying to hurt me maliciously. But their ignorance, combined with their absolute certainty that they knew best, had nearly caused irreparable damage to their own son. Here's what's going to happen going forward, I said, my voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who understood both the medical and legal implications of the situation. The hospital bed stays in my room. No discussion, no debate, no further interference of any kind. My medical decisions are mine to make, with guidance from qualified professionals. They nodded mutely. Second, I'll be moving out as soon as I'm medically cleared for independent living, I continued. I appreciate your help during my recovery, but I can't risk my health on family dynamics and household power struggles. Sweetheart, you don't have to leave, Mom said, reaching toward me before stopping herself. We can work this out. We can learn to understand better. Yes, I do have to leave, I replied firmly, because this situation proved that you don't respect my autonomy as an adult or understand my medical needs as a patient, and I can't complete my recovery in an environment where my health is subject to other people's uninformed opinions and household preferences. Dad cleared his throat roughly. What about all these legal documents? Are you going to use them against us? They stay active and enforceable until my recovery is completely finished, I said. Think of them as insurance, in case there are any more surprise decisions made on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. I wheeled myself toward the front door, then stopped and turned back to face them one more time. For what it's worth, I said, my voice softer but no less serious, I do understand that you thought you were helping me. But good intentions don't prevent spinal cord injuries. Medical equipment and proper protocols do. And the next time you think you know better than medical professionals, remember that your good intentions almost cost me the use of my legs. That night, I slept safely and soundly in my properly adjusted hospital bed, my spine positioned exactly as Dr. Martinez had prescribed. The bed hummed quietly as it maintained the precise angles and support levels that kept my healing vertebrae stable and protected. Over the following weeks, my parents kept their distance, clearly uncomfortable with the new dynamic, but no longer willing to challenge my medical decisions. They brought me meals and asked politely about my physical therapy progress. But they never again questioned my medical equipment or suggested they knew better than my doctors. The legal documents remained prominently displayed on my dresser, a constant reminder of how close we'd all come to a catastrophic mistake. 2 months later, Dr. Martinez cleared me for independent living with restrictions. The fusion was healing perfectly according to schedule, and I was successfully transitioning from wheelchair to walker, and eventually to walking short distances unassisted. I found a ground floor apartment with a fully accessible bathroom and modern medical accommodations, and I moved out on a Saturday morning with help from Jake and several other cousins. My parents helped with the move quietly and efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture without complaint or comment. As the moving truck pulled away from their house for the last time, my mother hugged me carefully, mindful of my still healing back and the walker I now use for stability. I'm sorry, she whispered against my shoulder, her voice thick with emotion and regret. We really didn't understand how serious it was. We thought we were helping. I know you did, I said, patting her back gently. But understanding comes from listening to experts and asking questions, not from making assumptions and ignoring medical advice. We should have asked more questions, Dad admitted, shaking my hand with unusual formality. Should have listened better to what the doctors were telling us. 6 months later, I was walking normally again without assistance. The fusion had completed successfully. The hardware remained stable and properly positioned, and my mobility was fully restored to pre-accident levels. I returned to my job at the hospital network, where my colleagues welcomed me back with relief and curiosity about my remarkable recovery outcome. How did you manage such a perfect healing result? My supervisor asked during my first week back at work. Most spinal fusion patients experience complications or setbacks during recovery. Strict adherence to proper medical equipment and protocols, I said simply, and very careful attention to following the doctor's orders exactly as prescribed. I didn't tell him about my parents' intervention or the legal documentation I prepared, or the night I'd spent researching medical negligence law instead of sleeping. Some stories are best kept private, filed away as learning experiences rather than shared as cautionary tales. But I did keep those legal documents carefully organized in a folder marked Family Medical Decisions, just in case. Because I'd learned that good intentions and family love don't always align with good judgment or sound medical practice. And I'd learned that sometimes protecting yourself means standing up to the people who claim to know what's best for you, especially when they don't understand what's actually at stake. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is refuse to let them harm you, even when they're genuinely trying to help. My relationship with my parents eventually healed, though it was forever changed by the experience. They learned to respect my independence more, question my decisions less, and never again assume they knew better than qualified medical professionals. And I learned that being grateful for family support doesn't mean accepting dangerous interference with my health and safety.